So even though physically we escaped, it changed my whole childhood. It was not whatever a normal childhood was. Suddenly had a sibling three months older than me. I'm sure they were wounded, but every Jew, we're all wounded from the Holocaust. So that's another reason that the Holocaust is so important to me. I'm a painter, and I've been painting for many, many years and exhibiting for many years. And in 1989, I decided to paint on the subject of the Holocaust, which is something personal to me and my family. And before that, I never talked about my background. Nobody even knew how old I was, because I used to look younger when I didn't have white hair. So I really began in 1989, because as I began exhibiting these paintings, I would give talks and I would have to talk about my relationship to the subject. But until 1989, most of my friends they sort of knew I was born in Europe, but they didn't know anything about me really. Both of my parents were born at the time when they had an Austria-Hungary Empire, and I think it was either Ukraine or Poland, I'm not quite sure. It might have been Ukraine. They met, of course, when they were adults, but both of them went to Vienna, were brought to Vienna as children. My father's family, my grandparents, from what I understand, brought the family to Vienna because there were 5 children and they wanted them to have a good education. And all those children, my father was close to what would be a PhD so they were very educated. My mother's family, I think, came here because there was so much poverty from wherever they lived. And I believe they were not very wealthy either in Vienna. When I went to Vienna in 1997, I did go to see where they lived, and it was even a poor section now. And my mother, I guess it was during the First World War, there was a famine. There was famine in Vienna, and a lot of Jewish children were sent to Holland to live with another family, sort of like Fresh Air Fund in New York for the deprived children. So my mother, I don't know how old she was, maybe 9 or 10, was sent to live with a family in Holland who adored her, and she loved being with them. And she lived in Holland, I think, until she was like 17 or 18. And she, of course, spoke fluent Dutch. And I think she became, the people were very wealthy and very cultured. So she herself, when you think of like cultured, elegant Viennese women, my mother was that kind of a woman. And my father came from more like an intellectual family. I came to the United States in 1940. The Holocaust has always been a very, very important part of my life. First of all, as a small child, I was never afraid of the boogeyman. I was always afraid of Hitler coming at night, like children are afraid of the boogeyman. After the war, through a long story, my parents located 2 of my cousins who had been in Bergen-Belsen. We had branches all over Europe, my father's business, and one of my uncle and my aunt and 2 small children went to Holland, thinking they'd be safe in Holland. And to make a long story short, very short, my uncle was taken to Auschwitz where he perished. My aunt and the 2 small children were first in Ravensbrück concentration camp, then they went Bergen-Belsen. The little girl is 3 months older than me, and her brother was a year younger. And these people, my aunt and these children, towards the end of the war, they were on the sealed railroad cars that were supposed to be taken to the east. They were liberated by, and terrible, they were in these railroad cars for 2 days, no food, no water. Everybody knows the story. When they were liberated, their mother was so ill that the children had to carry her out of the car. To make a long story short, my father located these children in Holland, and because we were not yet citizens, my father could not, even go and get them. So my uncle had to go to Europe, but they could not bring them to the United States because there was a quota. Because they were originally Austrian, the children were born in Austria. There was a quota, they could not be brought to the United States, so they were sent to Sweden, to school in Sweden for, I guess, a year or so, a few months, and then they came over for Sweden. what happened is they were brought up in my house. Not that number one, nobody else in the family wanted them, and secondly, my father was insistent that they stay with us. So the girl is 3 months older than me, the boy a year younger. And they came to my life when I was 10 years old, and that's very, very formative. And when they first came here, they talked very vividly about the experiences in the camps. I mean, what the terrible stories, and I kind of internalized them because I was a small child. This was, my cousin who ended up being like my sister, since they grew up with me as brother and sister. I have a younger sister. So the Holocaust, my younger sister who was born in the United States says, I don't have to learn about the Holocaust. It came into my house. Mm. So that's my relationship to the Holocaust. Even though we escaped the camps, I always grew up knowing the story that we had to escape, that my mother had to flee with me and all of this. But then I also had the childhood that came into my life. Wow. What I remember coming to the United States is, at the time, we were living in Ireland, in Dublin, and we had to go to Southampton to get the boat to the United States. And I believe it was the last boat out of Southampton. And I have two memories from that boat trip. I'm born on July 4th, and I knew there was going to be a big, big party on the boat. And somehow, during that evening, I realized the party was not for me and not about me, and it was for July 4th. And that was a heavy dose of reality. My other memory of that trip is that my father waking me up early in the morning because the boat was coming the ship was entering New York City, and he picked me up. I remember him holding me, looking at the Statue of Liberty. And that was very, very moving, even as a small child. I knew it was really important, and that's one of my earliest memories. Well, what inspired it is I told you earlier that I was painting other subjects, exhibiting all my other subjects. And I went to California, actually, in 1989, or 88, actually, 88. And I went to visit an elderly aunt. And as you do when you visit elderly relatives, you talk about the past and they show you photographs. And my aunt, at that time, there were these 35 millimeter tiny little photographs and negatives. They were all tiny. My aunt showed me a picture of an uncle of mine and a cousin who disappeared during the Holocaust. And she talked about this uncle and this cousin, and as she was talking, I realized that there's no trace of these people. We don't know what happened to them, really. And I suddenly realized there's no trace of these people anywhere in the world, except in the memory of my aunt and the memory of my mother, who were the only surviving people of that generation. And I just thought about it. Then I thought, well, I'm going to make a drawing based on this little photograph. So I made a little drawing. Then I made a bigger drawing. And that drawing became really large. And then I made a big painting based on that little photograph that my aunt had shown me. And on that painting, I wrote the names of the people and a little bit of their history. And I realized this was kind of very important in a very different way than my other paintings were important. Then I had lived in Paris a number of years earlier, and I had a friend who was an elderly painter. And when I was helping him clean up his studio one day, because he was actually going blind, and he showed me a little picture that he had cut out of a newspaper. He said, "This is something I wanted to paint, but I'll never paint it, so you take it." So I took the photograph because I liked this elderly, I respected this painter. And it was a photograph of, I can't remember the man's name, of a man with medals on crutches holding the hand of two small children who were wearing a Jewish star. And this is, it was based on a newspaper photograph. Then I remembered I had that little newspaper clipping. So I did another big painting. Actually, it's a 9-foot painting. Wow. Based on that photograph. And then I realized that was very meaningful to me. And then I started, looking at old family photographs and photographs of the Holocaust. And that led to that series. And I worked on those paintings. I did that series for about 13 or 14 years. And I've had many exhibitions of those subjects, especially in Europe, in Vienna. And I'm very proud that the big museum in Vienna bought 2 very large paintings. I mean, about 15-foot large installations. Yeah, makes me. They haven't been exhibited, but they're in the ownership of a museum in Vienna, and then I had a show in another museum in Vienna, and I had, I think, 13 or 14 solo shows throughout the United States, usually in colleges, of these paintings. Therapeutic was kind of painful. I would always before I started, I would do anything to avoid painting, and that's the wrong word, but I would, I didn't run to the studio because I was always kind of unhappy and they were they're very big, and a lot of them have multiple panels, and a few of them are painted like an altarpiece with two side pieces that stick into the room and a predel on the bottom, and they're very complex and very large. It was just they needed to be large. It was a large, important statement, and they had to be large. So for instance, the painting of the man with the two children, that's 9 feet high. Just to follow your dream. And there are going to be obstacles no matter what you do in your life, and you have to think about what you really care about, and then you'll overcome the obstacles.